Out of the many classic Disney attractions, the Haunted Mansion is one of the most timeless and iconic. It stands not only as a well-designed series of scenes with an immense amount of detail, but also as a representation of thousands of years of metaphysical speculation and belief. The idea of life after death is as old as humanity itself, and the ghosts that come with it are an essential part of civilization. I'm sure that if you're here watching this, you probably already have an inkling of the history of the Haunted Mansion. However, what no one really speaks about is the history that inspired it. Where does the ghost story come from, and how is it manifested into the attraction that we know today? The goal here is to explore not just the history of development behind this classic Disney attraction, but also to provide an overview of the culture and stories that you can find woven throughout. It's one thing to appreciate an attraction that is really well designed. It's another to be able to point to specific elements when you're riding it, understanding where they came from and the inspiration behind them. Join me today as we learn something new about the history of the Haunted Mansion, and gain new perspective on what makes this attraction a cultural force in and of itself. Before understanding the impact of ghostly history on the development of the Haunted Mansion, we should first define what it means to be a ghost. In Ghosts, A Haunted History, author Lisa Morton dedicates a chapter to this particular topic. According to her, in our contemporary Western thinking, the ghost is the spirit of a deceased individual that manifests itself to us after their death. But in the past, and in other cultures, the ghost may be very different. Belief in ghosts seems to be nearly universal, but the shape the undead spirit takes varies according to society's collective imagination. She first discusses the origin of Geist, a German word referencing a force of life. The word, as introduced into English, kept this meaning until around 1590. The modern conception of the Western ghost as an otherworldly, metaphysical spirit is found as early as Geoffrey Chaucer's poem, The Legend of Good Women, published in the 1380s. Published between 1599 and 1602, Shakespeare's Hamlet also featured the king, or Hamlet's murdered father, as the ghost archetype we are so familiar with today. Morton also references Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis, where ghosts are associated with fear and omens. In Venus and Adonis, Morton states, "Death is described as a grim grinning ghost," a phrase that would later become the title of the theme music to Disneyland's famous ghost ride, The Haunted Mansion. As Morton has previously stated though, not all conceptions of a ghost adhere to the contemporary archetype. In the West, the idea of a ghost is often conceptualized as a soul, which has remained in the physical world despite death, with the contemporary definition of soul taking on a similar meaning to the previously mentioned Geist. A ghost is a soul that can be tangibly experienced through our physical senses. One may experience a translucent figure, feel an invisible touch or cold spot, or even smell a scent associated with the deceased. However, not all conceptions of ghosts fit this description. Morton goes on to elaborate that different cultures sometimes thought spirits could take the form of an animal, or could perhaps be a tangible, touchable entity. In Britain, for example, there is a legend about the huntsman Gabriel Ratchets, who is accompanied by ghostly hounds. Concerning physical entities, Morton also uses the example of the Draugr in the Norse religions. The Draugr were anything but wispy spirits with little power. They were, instead, closer to revenants, reanimated corpses that could interact physically with mortal kin. Perhaps we today hold certain conceptions of what it means to be a ghost, but as Morton has illustrated, there's a lot of variety in interpretation. Taking into consideration the many interpretations of what it means to be a ghost, let's go back thousands of years into some of the earliest iterations of the ghost story. Ghosts in the ancient world often took on the role of aiding a hero's journey. In the case of Homer's Greek poem, The Odyssey, Odysseus travels to the underworld by the stream of Oceanos and convenes a number of shades. He digs a pit and creates a concoction of mixed liquids and sheep's blood, drawing to him the souls of the underworld. Odysseus allows the shades to drink the blood, but only after they answer his questions and reveal what he needs to continue his journey. One soul he consults is his mother, who reveals to him that she has died out of sorrow, thinking he was dead. Odysseus attempts to embrace his mother, but cannot do so because she is not tangible. Yet when more shades come to consume the blood, he draws his sword to keep them away until they can be questioned. This is an odd bit of narrative. The shades cannot be touched by Odysseus, yet can be kept away by his sword, and are able to consume the concoction. Another example of the ancient ghosts is with Virgil's Roman poem, the Aeneid, in which the hero Aeneas also travels to the underworld in order to gain information for his journey. On his way in, he encounters a number of dreadful entities and guardians, and is even ferried across the river Styx by the ferryman Charon. When Aeneas finally reaches his father, Anchises, he too attempts to embrace him as Odysseus attempted to embrace his mother. Like Odysseus, he fails to do so because Anchises is not corporeal. Anchises also plays the same role as the Shades in the Odyssey, in that he provides information that will guide the course of the rest of Aeneas' journey. In the case of these ancient poems, the idea of the ghost is quite different than the contemporary conception. It appears that they can be physical under certain conditions, and that they can drink blood or be driven back by Odysseus' sword, or that Aeneas can actually visit the underworld as a physical place. When actually interacting with the heroes, though, these shades cannot be physically touched. The role of guiding a hero's journey is not unique to Hellenized civilization, though. Morton makes this point about ancient literature in general when referring to another text. In the Sumerian tale Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld, dating from around 2000 BCE, the ghost of Gilgamesh's friend Enkidu returns to warn the great hero that any description of the afterlife would make him sit down and weep. The modern ghost can certainly play the role of advancing a protagonist's journey, as the ghosts in Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol do, but this is not prominent outside of ancient tales. Transitioning to a different area of the ancient world, ancient Egypt has had a large influence on horror films, and Morton touches a bit on this. The Egyptians believed in not simply a single soul, but multiple soul-like essences that combined to form an individual. The Ka was a spirit placed into an infant at birth, and forcibly separated from it at death. It always lingered close to the body, and so was typically thought to inhabit the tomb, where it was provided with the food, drink, and other necessities that it had enjoyed in its physical form during life. The Ba was the personality that defined each person. The Ak undertook the perilous voyage into the afterlife, where, if it survived a series of tests and trials, it would eventually stand before Osiris to be judged. The preservation of the body through mummification was done in order to allow the Ak to pursue eternal life. Spells were painted on the inside of the sarcophagi to assist the Ak in its journey. This is, of course, a religious practice, but one that influenced the malevolent mummies of horror films. Out of the many sources we have, there is one ancient story in particular that influenced the contemporary conception of ghosts the most. Morton relates the story of an ancient philosopher who rents a house and encounters a ghost in clanking chains. The ghost directs the philosopher to his buried but neglected body, and once properly attended to, disappears. The element of a ghost appearing because the dead was not properly taken care of seems to be a fundamental element associated with Western concerns of why ghosts might appear. Morton also cites another similar story, A Garden of Curious Flowers from the 16th century, penned by Antonio de Torquemada, that follows the same narrative. The ghost in clanking chains isn't always the most common aspect of the Western ghost story, but it certainly is an archetype. The ghost with clanking chains evokes in the Western imagination Dickens' A Christmas Carol again, where the ghost of Scrooge's partner, Jacob Marley, appears. Marley is restrained by chains, symbolizing his lifetime of greed, but otherwise, the hanging chains that one might find is oftentimes just a spooky element. Continuing on, the conception of ghosts in medieval Europe do not influence much in the way of popular culture today, but they do provide the origin of the modern ghost story. Concerning this era, Morton states, "Ghost stories were frequently collected by monasteries, where they served to prove the existence of the afterlife and the possibility of miracles. These tales, which usually centered on the spirits of saints or monks, might tell of a troubled spirit returning to seek masses or prayers, a ghost providing some form of instruction, or a supernatural visitor offering descriptions of angels, the Virgin Mary, or heaven." Come the modern era, Morton argues that ghosts abandon their religious context and instead invite secular views from the Age of Enlightenment. Despite the rise of skepticism towards the supernatural, sightings of such entities rose in popularity and were often associated with structures. Such stories often refer to poltergeist activity in houses or castles, where objects float and sounds are heard. Such ghost stories became quite popular, such as the case of the Cock Lane ghost in London. The story behind the haunting was not scary by contemporary standards, but simply related that the house on Cock Lane was haunted by a woman who died from smallpox. The haunting was said to have occurred because the woman had in fact been murdered for her money and wanted revenge. The case of the Cock Lane ghost was concluded to be a conspiracy in court, but the skepticism didn't stop the hordes of people who flooded Cock Lane in 1762, attempting to see the house of the reported haunting. The origin of the contemporary ghost story, though, really starts with the spiritualism movement. While often categorized as a religious belief, it really served to provide as a form of entertainment, and that it often entailed people coming together around a table for communication with the dead. A number of different people famous in the movement would travel and hold seances, claiming to communicate with the dead by using parlor tricks and conning gullible people out of their money. Some performances became quite elaborate, with the Davenport brothers even putting on the illusion of floating instruments. Sound familiar? For many, the allure of being able to communicate with a deceased friend or relative may be convincing, but the spectacle of the perceived paranormal activity brings the same sense of excitement as reading a ghost story or watching a horror film. Just from the description alone, the influence that the spiritualism movement has on the contemporary ghost story is clear. The idea of connecting with spirits from beyond through the use of a medium is an essential component of any story that has characters investigating a haunted house. Tobe Hooper's 1982 film Poltergeist is a prominent example of the spiritualism movement brought to storytelling. In the film, the Freeling family began to experience strange phenomenon in their house. The activity quickly escalates as the daughter, Carol Ann, is abducted by a malicious spirit and is sucked into a metaphysical dimension. In response, the Freeling family calls in paranormal investigators to help return their daughter. When they fail, they bring in a medium by the name of Tangina Barons, who helps the family to retrieve their daughter and seemingly end the activity. Morton speaks about the decline of spiritualism when in 1884, a gentleman named Harry Seibert dies and a large sum of money is donated to the University of Pennsylvania. The money was intended to establish a chair of philosophy at the university, under the condition that spiritualism be investigated as a practice. The report, published in 1887, had a less than stellar conclusion about the validity of it. As a boom of science and technology presented itself in the 20th century, though, belief in ghosts did not wane. Thomas Edison designed a machine that attempted to communicate with ghosts, and while Albert Einstein was a skeptic, his theories on the conservation of energy were twisted to present the idea that ghosts lived on as energy once the body died. Spiritualism did continue on throughout the early 20th century despite famous figures like Harry Houdini and Harry Price debunking many of the performances and showing how the tricks were achieved. With the invention of the camera, many paranormal photographs were staged and provided as evidence. One such photo came from the medium Colin Evans, who provided a photograph that attempted to show him levitating during a seance. Despite this, though, ideas derived from spiritualism and contemporary conceptions of ghosts as energy still persist today. There are a plethora of low-effort reality television series which showcase people running around with night vision cameras and screaming about orbs. Finally, though, we are now starting to see how the evolution of the ghost in the Western mind has evolved into what we know today. Morton argues that the definitive origin of the modern ghost story starts in 1764, with the publishing of Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto. Walpole's novel is the beginning and inspiration for the heavy use of ghosts in Gothic literature. Late in the story, the ghost turns around, revealing to the character Frederick a horrible sight of a skeleton in a cow, helping to inspire the ghost as a tool of fright. Anne Radcliffe, despite having rational explanations for her ghosts by the end of her stories, helped to bolster the Gothic genre as well, with such publications as The Italian, The Mysteries of Udolpho, and The Romance of the Forest. The rise of spiritualism also coincided with a golden age, roughly 1840 through 1920, for the ghost story. Such authors as Algernon Blackwood, Arthur Moncken, Charlotte Riddle, J. Sheridan, Leigh Fanu, Lord Dunsany, Vernon Lee, and Wilkie Collins contributed to the genre among many others. Most famously in 1898, the publishing of Henry James' The Turn of the Screw combined the ghost story with undertones of psychological anxiety and trauma, setting a precedent for stories told even today. Such examples are the films The Babadook and Hereditary, where themes of frustration and regret are present, adding the anxiety of the characters as an additional layer to the ghostly narrative. Jumping off of this, one of the most famous ghost stories, if not the most famous, is Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, published in 1959. Jackson's story is important not only because of its status among the genre, but also because it has the most direct influence on the development of the Haunted Mansion itself. It's also important to understand that while the story was influential, so was its film adaptation simply called The Haunting, released in 1963. The premise of the story is that the academic Dr. Montague is investigating psychic activity in a scientific manner and discovers a paranormal hotspot with the abandoned and evil Hill House. To help conduct his experiments, Dr. Montague searches for assistants that are sensitive to the paranormal, and manages to convince two women, Theodora, or Theo, and Eleanor, to come meet him there. Along for the ride is Luke, there to make sure that the property is being kept up with, as he will be the heir to the house. The Haunting of Hill House is a great narrative, and even Eleanor's personal anxiety and guilt plays a large part in allowing her to become a victim to the house, working as a great thematic archetype in establishing this story in the haunted house genre. At this point, I provided a pretty broad overview of the history of the Western ghost story, but I haven't really tied in too many specific elements of these stories into how they've influenced the development of the Haunted Mansion. Even as the single most influential film, I haven't touched on the elements of The Haunting and how the attraction drew so much from it. However, before we can understand how the attraction we see today was influenced by these many ideas, we need to first take a look at the development history behind the attraction itself. Former Imagineer Jason Sorrell in The Haunted Mansion, Imagineering and Disney Classic, states that the idea for the attraction started in 1951 with early conceptions of Main Street, USA, before Disneyland was even built. On the east side of Main Street, there was planned to be a crooked avenue that ended in a haunted house, overlooking an overgrown graveyard and church. This idea, however, was discarded in favor of other mini-lands, such as International Street, Liberty Street, and Edison Square. These of course never manifested on Main Street either, but did inspire Liberty Square at Magic Kingdom and the American Adventure at Epcot's World Showcase. The idea for a haunted house attraction came back into play in 1957, when Walt Disney assigned the project to Ken Anderson. The reason for doing so was because Anderson designed Snow White's Scary Adventures and Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, proving that he was capable of designing attractions with a scary thrill. At this time, there were plans to complement Frontierland with what eventually became New Orleans Square, and the haunted attraction was a part of these plans. Walt, in a BBC interview when in London, expressed his plan for a retirement home for ghosts. A bit tongue-in-cheek as a promotion, this notion did later factor into the actual story of the attraction though. There was also the issue of what the mansion itself would look like in order to fit into New Orleans Square. Anderson did research on the architecture of southern plantation houses, but the final design actually took inspiration from the Shipley Lydecker House in Baltimore, Maryland. Anderson also made a trip to the Winchester Mystery House in San Jose, helping to inspire the interior of the attraction just as it very much inspired Hill House, which we will get to in just a bit. The actual story behind the attraction went through a number of treatments, though. At this point, the mansion was a walkthrough attraction and centered around the story of Captain Gore. Guests would enter into the Gore mansion, escorted by either a maid or butler. The guests would go down into the basement on a moving platform with a guide pointing out secret passages, changing portraits, and moving objects. Standing in front of a portrait of Captain Gore, a pair of hairy hands would attempt to grab the guide, performed as an illusion. The guests would then encounter Captain Gore's bride and watched a series of scenes as she broke into the treasure chest and discovered that he was the infamous pirate Black Bart. The room would descend into darkness, and upon continuing through the attraction, guests would learn that she was either locked in the treasure chest or thrown down a well. Another story thrown around was that of Bloodmere Manor. The idea was that the manor itself had a bloody and violent history, but was being moved to Disneyland for restoration. Spirits in the manor executed pranks by smashing windows, furniture, and walls, and construction finally ended when a construction worker was walled up. A final conception of the mansion story included a lonesome ghost as a guide. The climax of this story ended with an overlook of the graveyard from the conservatory, with the Headless Horseman from Disney's The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad making an appearance. His arrival would signal the beginning of a wedding party featuring such characters as Dracula, Frankenstein, and the ghost of Julius Caesar, likely a reference to Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. This final treatment, of course, borrows a lot more heavily from Gothic horror and not exclusively the ghost story. Other elements, such as the lonesome ghost, or the ghost host, moving platform to the basement, the stretching room, and Captain Gore, which exists as a portrait Easter egg, have also made their way into the final iteration of the attraction, with the idea of the graveyard party, of course, playing the largest role. However, as the development of the attraction began to solidify with certain elements, Walt brought in Raleigh Crump and Yale Gracie, who would go on to become legendary Imagineers. Raleigh was known for his experience and interest in stage illusions, as well as the many odd, kinetic sculptures that he would often build. Yale, on the other hand, was a background artist who could also lay out detailed models. Together, the two men would work to create many of the earliest illusions and set pieces that would come to define the Haunted Mansion experience, often looking back to older techniques used in parlor tricks to achieve many of the elements found in the attraction today. For example, the ghosts in the ballroom scene were created through the Pepper's Ghost effect, in which painted models are reflected onto glass to give the illusion of a translucent figure. In a way, this usage of such effects almost works as a tribute to the early parlor tricks that came with the spectacle of 19th century seances. I have to imagine that this history was a direct inspiration on Raleigh and Yale when attempting to figure out how to create their own convincing ghosts. Creative direction on the attraction would stall yet again, as Walt tasked his Imagineers with creating a new slate of attractions for the 1964 New York World's Fair. The exterior for the Haunted Mansion would be built and completed as part of the new Disneyland expansion of New Orleans Square in 1963, but would continue to remain vacant until the project could start up again. When work resumed, Walt now brought in animator Mark Davis and background artist Claude Coates to help develop the project further. In conjunction with another new influence, Ex Atencio, who would write the script and lay out the overall narrative, the project would continue to develop into the attraction that we know today. As lead artist on the first audio animatronic show, The Enchanted Tiki Room, and a prominent designer for updates on Jungle Cruise scenes, Mark would bring his unique style of gags to the Haunted Mansion at a time when it was still quite scary. Claude, on the other hand, used his experience as a background artist to create the ominous and foreboding sets and atmosphere to work as a backdrop for Mark's designs. At this point in the development, the Haunted Mansion was designed as a walkthrough attraction with elaborate set pieces, and Raleigh at one point proposed a Museum of the Weird, taking the ghostly material in a more fantastical direction. Walt liked the idea of the many strange designs that came with it, proposing it work as a pre-show to the actual experience, where guests could take their time to look at all the different oddities. This idea won out over what would have been a haunted restaurant adjacent to the attraction, like the Blue Bayou for the also in-development Pirates of the Caribbean. However, when Walt died in 1966, the idea was scrapped when the project moved forward, although many elements, most famous of which was the Seance Room, made it into the final attraction. Walt had brought in Mark and Claude together to work on Pirates of the Caribbean, and their creative collaboration resulted in the fantastic ride that we still see today. However, with Walt now no longer being there to have final say, the two Imagineers fought for influence over the direction that the Haunted Mansion should take. Would it be lighthearted and full of the gags that Mark was known for, or would it take a scarier direction that incorporated the atmosphere that Claude had spent so much time conceptualizing? Well, as you can see, it's both. The first half of the attraction oozes creepy and horrific atmosphere that Claude excelled with, and the second half reflects that sillier direction that was the signature of Mark. Both tones were incorporated together beautifully with the help of Existencio, and the story of the mansion evolved from Walt's earlier comment about it being a retirement home for displaced ghosts from all over. On a side note, the attraction at this point was clearly no longer a walkthrough. With the development of Ford's Magic Skyway for the 1964 World's Fair, Imagineers took the continuously loading conveyor system and added vehicles capable of spinning and providing audio, allowing a narrative to play out and letting guests see only what the Imagineers wanted them to see. This new system, called the Omnimover, would first debut in 1967 with the Tomorrowland attraction called Journey Through Inner Space, but would obviously come next to the Haunted Mansion, all in the interest of guest capacity. Finally, after 6 years of speculation and often thematically appropriate morbid rumors, the Haunted Mansion opened at Disneyland on August 9, 1969. We've spent quite a bit of time becoming familiar with the history of the ghost story, and of course now the history of development behind the Haunted Mansion. Finally, it's time to tie it all together, and there's no better place to start than with Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. From the start, Hill House itself is described almost as being alive. The story never lets the characters actually witness any ghosts, and it's almost as if the house is an evil entity in and of itself. Objects move around the house mysteriously, doors will slam shut with no warning, and the house acts as a labyrinth, taking characters in circles and having them often get lost. No doubt the Winchester Mystery House, as mentioned earlier, was a large inspiration behind this depiction. The confusing layout of Hill House, often leading people to get lost, seems to have been emulated with the Haunted Mansion as well. We of course have the stretching room, trapping guests in with no way out. In the Magic Kingdom version, it includes a room with endless staircases, no doubt inspired by M.C. Escher's Relativity, but is very much in line with the endless hallways that define Hill House. However, the house itself isn't just confusing and dreary. Its foreboding nature is often described as if the house is watching the characters themselves. In the film adaptation of the book, this is done in a number of clever ways. For example, shots tend to linger on statues as if they are uncanny agents watching on behalf of the house. No doubt this evokes the busts that follow the guests in the Haunted Mansion itself. Another interesting choice in the film is the wallpaper. It's designed in such a way as if you could see faces if you stared long enough, which is not so subtly emulated with the iconic wallpaper of the Haunted Mansion itself. Even the gothic interior of the house appears to be lifted right from the film. In the hallway scene with the floating candelabra, the vast hallway seems to just keep stretching on, just as they do at Hill House, and at its entrance sits a chair with a design resembling a face, serving as another element of the house watching the guests. At one point in the narrative for Hill House, there's a night where Eleanor and Theo are in the same bedroom together. Suddenly, the room gets cold, and loud knocking can be heard out in the hallway, as if a violent entity is walking by and rapping on the doors, searching for people inside. The entity eventually finds their room, but cannot open the door. This scene repeats again later in the film with the other characters, but this time the entity begins to push the door inward, bending it as it does so. This has been directly brought to the Haunted Mansion itself, in which we see the doors of this hallway continue to have their knockers bang violently, and even encounter the bending door. Last, there's a scene where Dr. Montague observes a harp playing by itself in the music room, and in contrast, the various iterations of the Haunted Mansion have pianos being played by a shadowy phantom. Moving away from Hill House, though, many other aspects of the Haunted Mansion can find their origins through other sources and literature. For example, the seance room that made it into the mansion from the Museum of the Weird is obviously an emulation of the spectacle events that defined the spiritualism movement. This scene even includes floating instruments, calling back to the stunt pulled by the Davenport brothers as discussed earlier. If you're familiar with Edgar Allan Poe, you might also see some inspiration there. For example, one of the original ideas for the house was a talking raven that would work as your guide, though this was abandoned in favor of the ghost host. This raven can be found through a number of different scenes in the ride, but I suspect that it may have been inspired by the talking raven of Poe's poem, simply called The Raven. Earlier in the video, we also covered that conceptions of ghosts may change depending on time period and location. As a retirement home for ghosts all over, the Haunted Mansion makes some interesting choices in who it includes in it. For example, there's the coffin scene, where a reanimated corpse is trying to escape, calling for help as the doom buggies move on by. While not necessarily even a ghost, it does make me recall the inclusion of the Draugr, as Morton has already discussed. Another corporeal entity also seems to be the mummy sitting in the graveyard, and while we know that Egyptian conceptions of spirits are different, at least we're getting a bit of variety. If you simply observe the inhabitants of the graveyard scene, you'll see ghosts spanning from the medieval period to the Renaissance. However, in the ballroom, we see more consistency, in that these spirits seem to have died from around the 18th and 19th centuries. This seems to be more in line with what we associate ghost stories with today, and perhaps they are the permanent inhabitants of the mansion, with the party in the graveyard simply working to invite in ghosts from all over. A number of inhabitants of the mansion also seem to have been heavily inspired directly from popular stories, though. For example, the look for the original version of the bride in the attic was heavily inspired by the Brown Lady of Raynham Hall, although that bride was later updated to be Constance Hatchaway, who bears little relation. The Hatbox Ghost in Disneyland's version of the ride appears to be possibly inspired by the ghastly man in the beaver hat from the now lost 1927 film London After Midnight. Finally, the hitchhiking ghosts were likely inspired by stories of hitchhiking travelers, in which an unknowing driver would pick someone up, only to find that they had disappeared before they could reach their destination. I think it's easy to see that the Haunted Mansion as an attraction draws pretty heavily from a number of different sources, the most influential of which, The Haunting of Hill House, and its early film adaptation, still resonates with audiences today. It's interesting to me how the different styles of Raleigh Crump and Yale Gracie came together to form a cohesive experience, especially when all the scenes lack a single narrative to tie them together. In a way, their conflicting philosophies on how scary the attraction should be combines with a multitude of different ghosts inspired by a large variety of stories, works to celebrate the history of the supernatural entities that have defined human relationships to the afterlife for thousands of years. However, one thing that the Haunted Mansion is certainly missing is ghosts from Asia. I think a large reason for this is because ghosts are very much a Western concept, dating back to those earliest ancient stories such as the Odyssey and the Aeneid. It's certainly true that the Haunted Mansion does not seem to represent ancient ghosts, but they still play a fundamental part in defining the West and evolving into the more contemporary conceptions of ghosts that we have today. At least we have the ancient mummy, even if I wouldn't necessarily consider it much of a ghost, if even a Western one. At Tokyo Disneyland, the Haunted Mansion there is located in Fantasyland, and the reason often given for this is because Japanese culture perceives ghost stories more as fairy tales. Absent altogether at Hong Kong Disneyland, instead the park contains Mystic Manor, which is seen as a spiritual successor to the Haunted Mansion, but contains no ghosts due to cultural differences. Perhaps exploring this would be an interesting topic in and of itself. It's not the easiest to trace the culture and stories that inspired the Haunted Mansion, but we were still able to discover quite a bit regardless. The next time you read a ghost story or watch an older horror film, perhaps you'll discover something that possibly inspired the many ghosts that inhabit the Haunted Mansion. The goal of the video was to explore the history of the ghost story, as well as the development of the Haunted Mansion in conjunction with it. In that regard, I hope that you've learned something, and perhaps your perspective on the attraction has changed. Many of the older Disney classics took inspiration from history and the many cultural interpretations of it. There's nothing inherently wrong with use of IP in new attractions, but they just simply lack the depth and cultural context that defines many of the older ones. That is something that I very much appreciate, and I hope you do as well. As always, you can support the channel by just leaving a like on the video, and hitting the subscribe button with bell notification to be alerted when new videos are released.